So we're moving swiftly on to look a little bit more about the global supply chain problems, and will the global supply chain keep up with the accelerated rollout of more renewable technologies? I mean, Paulina, you're right at the coalface, or I mean, I should use a different analogy, but I don't know what one is for renewable energy. But you know, your products are more in demand than ever before, and yet we have seen Siemens Gamesa and other manufacturers have to make job cuts, you know, making heavy losses. What's going on?
I love your comments, Ben, by the way, because I was feeling the same listening to the panel before around where we are. I mean, I have been with wind industry for almost 20 years. So I started when we still had some fishing vessels going to first turbines, you know, and I ran offshore wind farms and onshore wind farms all around Europe. I have never seen supply chain issues like we have now, ever. And in my eyes, it's a huge crisis. It's not just a problem that we're facing and it will pass. It's a massive crisis we're facing today. First of all, the COVID pandemic, as well as the current European Russian crisis, impacted us dramatically when it comes to raw materials. And that's not just the prices, but the delays in getting those raw materials to be able to manufacture. Our contracts are signed usually 5, 6, 7 years ahead. Nobody anticipated, and I think somebody said on a panel before, which I really love, you can't plan for the crisis. You can't plan for that scale of crisis. Combine that together with, like I said, increases in prices, the delays. First of all, we've got projects that are now 4 times more expensive, and secondly, we can't deliver them on time, which means we pay liquidated damages to our customers. And we've been chatting with Brian over the break, and we said, you know, this is probably the sexiest industry that everybody wants to be in that makes no money. And that is the reality I'm facing at the moment, and we are facing as the organization. And I don't think that everybody realizes that, and I think I will speak, although I don't have my major competitors here like Vestas, GE, or Nordex, we all are in the same situation. And of course, if one of us will leave the market, and some did, like Senvion, when Siemens Gamesa acquired Senvion 2 years ago, those prices are going to go up even more. Because of course, you have decreased capacity in being able to manufacture. And on the top of that, there is less of you to do so. So the raw material prices, the COVID, plus the way we plan for the onshore and offshore projects have been really killing us at the moment.
And which raw materials are particularly problematic, or are all of them? And where do they come from? Is there any hope on the horizon of an improvement, or is this a long-term issue?
So I think, first of all, is there green shoots on the horizon? Yes, but not in the next 2 years. And that's the problem. Because if you look at the expectations currently, we are looking at the European targets at 2030 of 510 gigawatts of power being installed. We are installing at the moment, we are at the moment at 190. The expectation is you will see 39 gigawatts per year, and we're installing 11. So we are far away from the expectation. And then, of course, where are the materials coming from? So to answer your question, key materials, steel, copper, carbon fiber, everything we need comes from mostly China and other countries, of course. If you look in China, then China installed 5 times the amount of offshore and onshore wind compared to Europe in 2021. And of course, they've got those materials, those raw materials at home. So we are facing not only an issue of trying to get those, but now being at the end of the queue when it comes to actually delivery and logistics of getting those materials into Europe, for example.
Brian, if European manufacturers like Siemens Gamesa are at the end of the queue now, you've got a lot of big Chinese turbine makers who might want to start to look beyond their part of the world and to Europe and the US and the targets there. Are European manufacturers always going to be at the end of the queue? I mean, is this a sort of terminal problem, perhaps?
No, I couldn't agree more that we're not only in a period of severe concern with respect to supply chains, we should be in a moment of crisis and panic. There is a prospect of normalization of the supply of steel and aluminium and logistics and shipping, and to an extent copper over the next 2 years, as Paulina suggests. There's the supply of critical minerals going into batteries, rare earth metals, going into permanent magnets for wind turbines is much, much more problematic.
So those critical material, what are they exactly?
Well, but what we do is TechMet. I mean, our part of the energy transition equation is quite a specific and narrow one. We just produce and process and recycle the critical minerals going into batteries. So we do lithium, cobalt, and nickel for lithium-ion batteries. We do rare earth metals for permanent magnets for wind turbines and electric engines. We do tin as a connector in all electrification. We do vanadium as vanadium redox flow batteries. So, these are the critical minerals that are going into a lot of the key technologies that will facilitate climate change mitigation. And there are two fundamental problems. One is structural short supply, because we as an industry needed to spend, invest $100 billion 3-4 years ago in order to avoid the cliff we're heading towards over the next 2, 3, and 4 years with respect to adequate supply of these materials to meet the demands of the growth of electric vehicle manufacturing, let alone renewable energy systems. So that's the first big problem. The second big problem is the fact that China, as Paulina mentioned, has spent 20 years executing in an enormously successful program of securing a dominant position and, in fact, in some instances, outright control of global supply of these critical minerals. So today, China controls, of our metals, 65% to 95% of the global supply chain. And that has been fine while China has had the capacity and the willingness to support and supply the world's industries. So Tesla today, as a result of the easy world of easy money and easy supply of materials that they've grown into, buys probably 85% of their inputs in Nevada from China, and China can close them down in 4.5 weeks, and that's not a good place to be. It's not a good place for Tesla, it's not a good place for the United States, it's not a good place for freedom and democracy, in my view, and therefore it is one of the key fronts in the new Cold War against China, which again, excuse me for using emotive language, but it's a reality, and it's a reality of the world we are going to be living in for the rest of our lives, and that reality will involve some significant ups and downs, in trade, conflict, and diplomatic discomfort and instability. And in that environment, China is going to do two things with their overwhelmingly dominant position of control over these supply chains. They're going to advantage domestic industry relative to industries in the States and Europe and elsewhere, quite naturally, because if you can, you've got a limited supply of lithium and nickel, you're going to give it to your own industry before you're going to give it to the industries here. And secondly, they're going to use it as a tool or a weapon in any of those escalations of conflict or competition, which will occur periodically over the remainder of our lives. And that's an enormous source of geopolitical instability and national security implication for the Europe and the US, and a source of enormous vulnerability for a successful energy transition. And to remedy that and balance that position is a massive undertaking. I mean, I think that you mentioned that wind and solar have radically outperformed expectations over the last 10 years. One of the reasons they've radically outperformed expectations is because there had been a wall of money looking for climate change mitigation technologies. And we've lived in a world of cheap money and plentiful financing over the last 15 years. And that's over. We're in an environment now of high increasing and sustainably higher interest rates, higher and sustainably higher inflation. And we, even in the good days of cheap money, never benefited from that. So all of these wonderful financial institutions like Blackstone, who are committed to energy transition and net zero and everything else, have been very, very keen on wind turbines and solar, etc., and have been much less keen on metals and mining because somehow it's perceived as being fundamentally negative from an environmental impact point of view and a carbon footprint point of view, which it doesn't have to be, and everything we do is clean and sustainable and well governed. And therefore, the money hasn't been there, and the money's still not there. Right. We need to close this gap in this radically increasing supply-demand dislocation for these critical minerals. We need to spend another $50+ billion a year for the next 10 years. And there's a time lag which is going to be very expensive, and the implications of which are very, very severe. And we do need to look at that cost of failure.
Brian's painting quite a bleak picture on critical minerals there. That there's some signs of stabilisation in other components like steel and copper. But Ben, what did you think about what Brian was saying there? The sort of core issues around critical minerals, where China effectively controls the market.
Yeah, I mean, I think everything Brian has said is a reality. I mean, where I would perhaps have a slightly different perspective is, I mean, around two things. I mean, first of all, I hope that we're not going to have a dystopian, future of permanent war and Cold War with China or anyone else. And China is a place where I still hope that many great things will happen. I'm a frequent visitor to China, or at least was before COVID, and work very closely with a lot of people in China who feel as passionately about climate change as I do. So I don't want to create a kind of us and them. And the reason for that is because we're actually going to need everything China's doing and a lot more. I mean, in fact, there shouldn't be an either or. I mean, really, we need everything that China's doing, and we should be going at least as fast in the West. And the West actually did have a big technological advantage in wind industry, and still does to a certain extent, particularly around sophisticated turbines for offshore and other areas, right? And the West, started the Chinese wind industry, and I know people who were some of the first people to go there. So I mean, the two industries worked together, and the Chinese industry worked around, to a great extent, Western IP and companies that they acquired as well. So, I mean, really, we need a global industry. Climate change is going to require everyone's best efforts. And I do think that, we need to try and avoid trade war around these kind of critical components, because we simply don't have time to scale up everywhere else apart from China in time. Having said that, Brian, I do agree with your point, and I do think a kind of rebalancing is really important. I mean, there is too much risk around concentration at the moment, and I think a diversification of the supply chain is really important. You've seen, several European countries are now trying to create rare earth metals processing plants. I mean, we need a diversification of steel supply. And can I just also point out, this is not just for us, this is for everything. I mean, we're not talking about wind turbines specifically, we're talking about large, heavy steel castings, we're talking about ball bearings, we're just talking about industry. It's like industry is in China, and somehow it needs to be other places. Now, one last comment. One hopeful thing, for instance, is what the US is doing. I mean, I think the Inflation Reduction Act is incredibly helpful, and it's going to provide, 10 years now of real stability, not just for our industry, but also for green hydrogen, for the decarbonisation of cement and steel. There is a certain reshoring element around bringing some of that back into the US to reduce risk, and I think that's a good approach, because it's around incentive, and it's about making sure things speed up, and I think we all need to speed up. But let's try not to get into a trade war when we are so far behind the renewable energy targets as it is.
Yes, I don't think many governments will go out with the purpose of trying to start a trade war at the moment with the way the global economy is. But Paulina, we know that from the solar industry that once China starts doing something and does it very well, it reduces prices, and they come to dominate an industry. Are you fearful that could happen with wind as well? That the Chinese companies could start to dominate the market, and European manufacturers simply edged out?
Of course, I'm fearful, because I already see it happening. I mean, if you will look at the moment, the latest projects in countries like Turkey, France, Spain, the Chinese manufacturers are already here. So I think that's the key here. I fully agree, Ben, what you said. It should never be the neither or. It should be end situation. So certainly it should happen. The challenge we've got is that at the moment the end is only floating one way. So we have Chinese manufacturers on our shores in Europe, yet we cannot be in China. Because of the way that at the moment China is protecting that market. So I am absolutely all up for competition and for the best one to win. But in order for that to happen, we need to have an equal entrance to that competition. And I think at the moment we are not quite there at that stage. In regards to, if you look currently at the Chinese manufacturers, they learn, of course, very, very fast. And the biggest challenge we've got is the price. And if we will make onshore and offshore industry all about the price, rather than quality of the delivery, the knowledge, the safety, and everything that comes with it, also the input into the innovation, and then we will have an issue for sure. And if I look at where we were just in Siemens Gamesa and the first projects we sold in onshore and offshore, and to where we are now, I have, again, it's completely unprecedented race to the bottom. It really has been. And don't get me wrong, many of us right now said, now we stop, because there is no bottom anymore. I mean, we're below. And if you look at the results, that is genuinely the case. Then, of course, we started to work with our customers, with our suppliers, to see how can we actually work together in order to make sure we can deliver sustainable onshore and offshore wind. Because the sustainability is in us being able to then invest in R&D, which we have been doing in Siemens Gamesa. Without making money, we invest 400 million euro in innovation. But then we have to be able to pass that into the permits of our customers. So when they're bidding on projects, they're able to say, okay, 30% of your PPA will include the really qualitative investment into the innovation. And there is a very different approach to the way we should bid, rather than say which one is the cheapest, we'll take it. Mm-hmm. And I think that is the challenge right now, that the sustainability is not, let's say, plugged in at the beginning of the permitting process and all of the planning you were describing, Ben, but expected at the end, right? Well, if we keep pushing that problem down the line, like I said, we will see some of the European manufacturers disappearing from the current landscape, which again is already happening, right? It's not something that is a myth, it's already happening. I mean, in our example, Senvion was the great example, right? So I think for me, it needs to be really thought through for all of us coming together to finding the solutions, the quantitative solutions to the current targets. Target is only a target when you're able to list, sets of actions of how you're going to deliver that. Unless, otherwise it becomes a nice aspiration, which at the moment is a little bit that. It's a great aspiration. Mm-hmm. But if you ask me, how are we going to install 39 gigawatts installed capacity per year without supply chain, in the backup of that, without expectation of the government, the innovation will come in at the beginning of the permitting process? Very difficult to answer.
Brian, what's your assessment? Ben mentioned there that we do need diversification of supply chain. What's your assessment of some of the efforts that are going on in that sort of field at the moment, and how successful do you think we can actually be diversifying away from China?
We can be, and there's a lot going on. And as Ben mentioned, the IRA legislation in the US is a massive step forward and will make a big contribution to scaling localization and friend-shoring, or whatever they call it, supply chains outside of Chinese control. Firstly, I agree with you totally. There's no point China bashing. China's made a massive contribution to our industry. If it wasn't for China, what China has done with critical minerals and these technologies and scaling manufacturing and production over the last 15 years, we'd be in much, much worse position than we are now. However, for the next phase, we do need to balance that. The fundamental problem is it takes 8 to 12 years to build a new mine and metals processing capacity, and it takes 2 or 3 years to build a new battery gigafactory and EV manufacturing capacity and capacity to build wind turbines and solar parks. So you have a natural disconnect which we haven't planned for adequately in terms of what we should have been doing 5 years ago. And that's what's going to create the dislocation and metal prices much higher for much longer, much more inflation, much lower margins for the producers of these systems, be they batteries, be they wind turbines. And that has big implications, forget about China. And what we do to solve that, and particularly in the renewable energy sphere relative to the EV sphere, the plans and the commitments of the VWs of this world to spend $60 billion and electrify their fleet over 5 years is going to draw in, together with GM and Ford and the Chinese growing quicker than anybody else in batteries and EVs and Tesla, is going to draw in every last kilogram of nickel and lithium and cobalt that the world can possibly produce in 2, 3, 5, 7 years' time. There are not going to be lithium-ion batteries available without massively higher price and massively long lead times for on-grid and off-grid battery storage to contribute towards facilitating the next phase of renewable energy. And therefore, we are going to have to look at other technologies for grid-scale battery storage that don't involve lithium-ion batteries. And this is one of the sort of dislocations and crises that I don't think is yet adequately appreciated. The assumption is you can kind of get these things, you just phone up China and maybe we're dependent on China. They're not going to be able to supply themselves, let alone us. So it's not just a matter of geopolitics and national security imperative of balancing China. It's a matter of somehow having enough to do what we need to do to meet China climate change goals, which, as coming from sitting where we are in mining and metals, it's just not possible. So again, on the one hand, we need to do everything we can to narrow that gap by spending more now, quicker government support, funding agency support, regulator support, and we will, and some of the work is being done, but not nearly enough, nearly quick enough. On the other hand, we need to prepare for failure. And what are the implications of needing fossil fuels, more of them for longer, when there's been massive underinvestment in fossil fuel development? What are the implications of having metal prices double where they are now for most of the next 10 years in terms of inflation and cost of these systems, etc.? They're big implications.
Ben, I could see you itching to interrupt there.
No, I mean, I was just smiling because it's such a world of pain that Brian is talking about. I'm almost kind of hurting inside just listening to him. However, I do think pretty much everything he said is accurate from what I understand it. And I think what Brian's saying is that to a certain extent we're not really ahead of this issue, and we need to be. It's almost like we just expect it to happen, and I think that's what we do with a lot of energy transition kind of themes. And this is probably the top of importance. And as he said, I mean, it's not even going to be enough to supply China. And we saw already 2 years ago when China had its big kind of rush before the expiry of the feed-in tariff. I mean, it sucked components and materials from all over the world for just to install its own wind projects. I mean, they were sucking balsa wood from Ecuador. Now they're growing their own balsa wood forest, by the way, in southern China. To have their own balsa wood and so on and so on. So I do think we need to, A, kind of get ahead of this and think about it on a really strategic level. B, I think we can flip this around and say this is an incredible opportunity for regions outside of China because there's so much that needs to be done. And C, I think some of it, as Brian said, will be met by going faster, going bigger, but we also need to think about innovation and how do we not, we can't just replace every kind of molecule of one material by another. We need to somehow think about how can we do this better, what can we substitute, what other processes can we substitute for the ones we're around. So are there synthetic ways of doing rare earths? Are there wooden turbine towers? Are there new processes and materials for blades? I mean, all these things the industry is looking into, right? But we need, as Paulina said, we need to be able to invest in these solutions to be able to do all this. And again, it's not a matter of just coming along behind and expecting things to happen. And at the moment, the auction system is basically set up to squeeze as much value from the supply chain and get the lowest possible price for the consumer. But crazy thing is, we're at probably 40 euros per megawatt hour, 40, 50 globally. Gas is like 140, 150. So how does that work? Why does there have to be such an enormous gap between the price that we provide energy at and the price that fossil fuel provides energy at? We can still be extremely competitive and have money to invest in the future and in supply chain and in resolving all these complex issues that Brian is identifying.
With the auction system, do you just think it's inevitable that people will start to bid at higher prices? That the end that we've seen, the bottom of sort of super cheap CFD strike prices, you're just inevitably going to have to start passing on those.
We already are. So we found ourselves in a position when we had to renegotiate contracts, and many of the customers will be here or investors of some of those wind farms when we are not just building new, but by the way also renegotiating the current agreement. So I of course look after service, so we've got everything from 2, 5, 10, 15, now in onshore 35-year service agreements. And of course we have to do that because we are not able to sustain the current expectation of the cost reduction and price. You mentioned that, of course, getting rid of resources, and Ben, I saw your comments in one of the interviews when we said we should be employing more people rather than letting them go. And you're completely right. The problem is we can't afford to keep them because you need to pay them. And then on the top of that, of course, for me comes something that is extremely important, is that innovation part. Because it's the closed circle. If you will not invest upfront, you will not see this. We now have recyclable blade. We are looking at onshore, offshore recyclable blades, but that's the development that took over, that took 5, 6, 7, 10 years to get to that point. And I think that is what is absolutely critical. We need the investment upfront to be able to then develop new ways of doing things. And I think, you know, the supply chain, and that's not, by the way, just for raw materials, but, you know, if you look at the current CTVs, SOV situation, so the logistics as well, you know, we are talking about, I was talking to Brian over the break, and we discussed, you know, I really would like to see now CTVs running on the, you know, on the batteries or hybrid hydrogen. Well, if we're not going to get the battery for cars, you know, where are they going to come from for the logistics in offshore wind? So I think for me, it's all connected together. And to me, Ben, you absolutely said something that is critical. We need to start thinking up front rather than facing the problem when we're already there. At the moment, we're already there. So now I think is the time to stop and say, okay, what are we going to do differently? Because I think passing the cost to each other, it's also not a solution. It's about sitting together with the governments and saying, okay, are the targets for renewable currently realistic? You know, because we welcome them, but are they really something we can achieve, or are they aspiration? Mm-hmm. What it is we can really achieve based on the current situation, and then what needs to be done to then accelerate to be able to have an action plan that delivers the target. And I think that to me is the piece that there is a lot of discussions, there is a lot of getting together, there is a lot of conferences, but I think we are still yet to find that commitment or the solution. And I think the government discussion is definitely the one that needs to drive that, because that's where the permits are being generated. That's where auctions happened. That's where many of the investors that sit here will say, okay, am I going to get my return or not? If I will, okay, I will invest. If I not, why would I? I mean, I'm responsible for somebody's money. I fully understand that, by the way. But I think that's where we really need an interaction on a different level. For me, there is still too much bureaucracy, and I see us making mistakes in the new countries coming in. The same mistakes that we did 10, 15 years ago in the UK. There is still not enough sharing in between the countries, you know. We're now seeing Poland booming in offshore wind, you know, everybody gets really excited. I mean, you should really, and many of you are, take part in some of those discussions for the new projects. I mean, it's really, it's the pain I can't even begin to describe. You know, it really is very, very difficult. So it's such an exciting industry. It's one I'm hugely passionate about. But we need to recognize we are in a place of crisis. Mm-hmm. And I think once you recognize that, it's much easier to address it, because then we know we need to put a different pace of urgency around actions.
Yeah, right. The first question that I asked Ben in the last panel was the difference between the rhetoric, the very high-level targets, and the reality. And from what you're saying, there seems to be a yawning chasm, really, between the two. Do you think, therefore, that the targets you mentioned there, are they targets or are they aspirations? It doesn't sound as though you're terribly confident that we can meet those targets with the current problem.
I think I'm confident about the target when I can prove sort of its plan for delivery. So like I said, if you look at the Europe at the moment, 510 gigawatts expected by 2030. Currently, we're at 190. So we need to be delivering per year 39 gigawatts. We have delivered 11. I mean, that's it, right? So where is the 18 going to come from? You know, it needs to come from permits, but the permits are there. We need to be able to manufacture enough wind turbines to be able to fulfill that. We're struggling with the supply chain. You know, and I think also that there is, of course, as you all know, there is a race for size. And we can't continue developing the bigger, the better wind turbines if we are not making money. They're as simple as that. You know, and if you would see some PPAs, even, you know, in US at the moment, the discussions about 30 megawatt turbines, right? I mean, that requires significant amount of development and R&D to go into such a size, right? And I remember I was there when we had the first 6 megawatt turbine offshore, and I thought this was the end, by the way. So I was wrong completely, right? Now we are at a much bigger scale. But again, to get to the size, there needs to be infrastructure to support it. You need to transport those things. You need to be able to install them. There needs to be the whole system behind for that development to happen. And I think, so when we talk about the target, I think we should set ourselves ambitious targets, but they need to be then supported by clear action list. If there is no action list for those to be fulfilled, then it becomes an aspiration.
Okay, so if you were sitting, if this room was filled by energy ministers from across the world, what would you put on that action list then? What is going to sort of break this quite bleak picture that we are painting here? Sorry to depress everyone in the afternoon.
I think the first thing needs to be planning and permitting, and Ben said that already. We talk about planning constantly, right? And we talked about it for 10 years. Planning and permitting needs to be at the forefront of the change. And that needs to include, like I said, an ambitious requirements for the operators who build the wind farms to include in those, that that is not just about the price, but it is about the innovation and quality of the delivery. And I think that is a very different discussion. If you put that at the forefront of the conversation, that will drive those that build wind farms, our operators, very differently, right? So the planning and permitting is absolutely number one. I think for me, number two is something we haven't discussed yet, but it's also a requirement. We always talk about local content. I mean, we cannot build a factory in every single country or every single city. I mean, it's not possible, right? So what does that local content mean? And then we back to innovation around where do we get and source our materials from, right? We then talk about green steel initiatives, which also Siemens Gamesa is part of. Those we need to then again, support and accelerate in order for those materials to come from the different places rather than the obvious ones. And I think, again, I see the China topic also from the different angle that Ben sees it. I think we need to bring some healthy competition to China. But for that to happen, the local manufacturers need to be supported more. So again, it's that government, let's say, backing where you do have the local supply chain coming in, much more than it is today. And I think, again, it needs to be, for me, the wind industry needs to be sustainable. And that means end-to-end, including the logistics as well. Yeah? So I think if I would have those three, and the grid, of course, connectivity comes as well dramatically into that conversation. But I think for us, if those three will be addressed, the world will be a better place.
Ben, I'm going to come to you in a minute, but we've got 10 minutes to go, and I'd love to take some questions from the floor. So if you could raise your hand so people could come around in microphones just while we're continuing. But please don't be shy. Ben.
No, I mean, I do see it actually very similarly to you, Pauline. I mean, I think we need to create healthy competition for China. I mean, the problem we've had is that the last 2 or 3 years, fully 65% of the entire global market has been China and the US, which is really interesting. I mean, two very different countries, but ones where, in their own ways, they get things done. It's actually, the worry for me is kind of everywhere else. It's the emerging markets, and it's Europe that's been underperforming. And it's whether we can get all those areas which are extremely important up and running in places like India, which is on track to be one of the biggest global emitters, and can we get those places going? Is what worries me. I kind of think now with the IRA in the US, they're going to have 10 years of pretty solid growth now, and I think China will continue doing what China does, which is create enormous scale for its industry. But we need to get everyone else firing on all cylinders as well, and create diversified supply chain, good investment conditions, and competition, healthy competition.
Are mandatory targets for things like, European-made turbines, are they helpful or just too much of a distraction?
Of course, I'm a turbine manufacturer. I think you know what I'm going to say. So will they be helpful? Absolutely. But I think what I would rather pick up on is what you said, is that healthy competition. If we've got, I'm more than happy to compete and to prove that we have the best product. But I would like to have the same entry place. Yeah, and I think that we quite not there at the moment. That is what's challenging. I think also the mandatory target, pushed down, and all of us here working in the corporate organizations know what that means, right? It's either the hammer or the carrot. And of course, I'm not sure that the hammer works anymore. It's around now, how do we bring everybody to the table to have a really, like I said, rather than emotional discussion when everybody is super excited about the industry, to say what it is you're actually going to do. And I think that is the conversation that needs to happen. So instead of creating long list of promises, we need two things that will happen on the government level and on the European Union level, by the way, within the European market. How are the country's government going to work together to help, again, that permitting process to look a little bit differently to what it looks like right now? I can promise you that building the wind farm right now is not the problem. Exactly like Ben said. Building an onshore and offshore wind farm is not an issue. We know how to do this. We know how to do this fast, safe. We know how to change the components. the issue we've got is that we don't know what's going to happen. So the stop-start of the policies that Ben described, I can't plan the innovation R&D budget if I don't know if I'm going to sell the turbine or not. Now, if I manufacture and everything is then stored, my capex is frozen for anything else that I can do to then push really the boundaries like the recyclable blades and so on and so forth. So I think for us, the uncertainty of the stop-start, it's been killing us together with the supply chain issue we had. You know, we had projects that have been postponed to 3 years that we have been planning for. Or we had situations where we were working on projects for 2 years and then the customers were cancelling those because they were saying, actually, I don't know what my return is anymore. And I think that uncertainty is really causing huge issues at the moment.
Yeah.
Any questions from the floor? Right, Brian, I'll go to you, and then there's one at the back, please.
No, I think healthy competition is not the answer. Healthy competition suggests letting the markets take care of the problem, and the markets are failing to take care of the problem. When you have competition on the part of China that has much lower permitting requirements and much lower ESG standards and cheap or free money, you don't have a level playing field, and if you want to compete, you have to counter that by providing cheap money and by de-risking and encouraging private sector to fund by government action in order to level the playing field funding-wise, and as we have said, create somehow more efficient permitting processes that can't be held hostage by minority interest groups and endlessly delayed. And that's therefore what we have to do when you've got big systemic global risks like climate change, like the rise of China, which again, I don't want to bash China or get into Cold War rhetoric, but it's a reality. You can't leave it to the market. The market's failing us. You need aggressive government action.
Just very quickly, I mean, I think that's what's happening. I mean, I think that's what the US is doing through the Inflation Reduction Act. I mean, it's literally throwing a rather large amount of money, something like 300
and we need double and triple that.
There's 270 billion just for renewables. I mean, it's a blunt instrument, and it gives a strong incentive to their industry. And to be honest, I'd like to see Europe doing the same.
They have to.
And why not support its industry?
I'd like to squeeze in this question, please. If you could say your name and where you're from.
Yes, good afternoon. Mark van Baal, follow this from the Netherlands. Great to hear that's not really a technical problem, that we need to move fast. I have a question about the developing countries. There's a lot of talks about developing countries like Africa. They need to get access to electricity and they need gas to develop. I think when we allow the third world to go through the same development as we did here in the developing countries, we're doomed. We will never reach the 1.5 degrees, let alone, and not the 2 degrees. So we need Africa to leapfrog. So what do you need from governments, investors, to be able to make developing countries leapfrog oil and gas?
Who would like to take that? Yep.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the problem in many places in the emerging market world or developing world is that they're still installing coal. And coal is still, in absolute terms, emissions are growing very, very fast because even though they're doing more renewables, coal is still being installed at a very fast rate in India, in Vietnam, in Indonesia, and in China as well. So, I mean, first of all, we need a framework where there's a very clear incentive for people not to be doing that, but to be doing renewables. I mean, I do agree with your point. We don't need to repeat the whole cycle of 19th century or 20th century industrial development that we went through in Europe, and there's a reason why heavy industry relocated out of Europe to other places. And I do think, again, this innovation piece around how do we create a better form of industrialization, a better form of mining, better form of creation of materials is going to be absolutely key. And I see real advantages in areas like circular economy and all these kind of areas, which are going to be absolutely key to making sure that the energy transition is a clean energy transition as well. So.
Lovely. Well, I'm sure especially the issues around critical minerals will be discussed. We have another FT summit towards the end of the week, a mining summit, so I'm sure that's something that's going to be discussed in more detail then. And Mark will actually be joining me on stage tomorrow as well for a fireside chat. But in the meantime, that was a fascinating panel. Some cause for optimism, some cause for worry there, but plenty of thought to go away with. Thank you ever so much to all three of my panellists for joining us. If you could give them a warm hand, please, and then I'll pass over to my colleague.